Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the day so far. It's been great. I especially enjoyed the talk about finances and about your behaviors around money, and really interesting. I'm sure there's a neuroscience of money somehow, but it really intrigued me. So I began my career as a physiotherapist, actually, and I worked for many years in an MS clinic. In the clinic I worked in, was fortunate that there was a physiotherapy position. And I worked in both MS and stroke, and my observation was that people with MS, I felt, weren't getting the full spectrum of rehabilitation of what was available. For stroke, there was clear guidelines about the care that people received. So people with stroke received functional electrical stimulation, special types of treatment called constraint-induced movement therapy, and it was clear to the therapist what should be being provided. And so I set about in my graduate work to try to understand neuroplasticity and brain recovery in stroke. But then now what I'm doing is translating some of that and testing some of those concepts in people with MS. But today what I thought I would talk to you mainly about is some research that I did as a postdoctoral fellow. And my idea was that in the clinic, we would have a busy clinic, there'd be a lot going on, and sometimes there were older people, so this would have been in the early 1990s. So there were older people in the clinic who had a lot of knowledge, so older patients with MS who had a lot of knowledge about living with MS, and this was before disease-modifying drugs. So they were tried and true, and I call them the seniors, the veterans. And then there were young people coming in who had so many questions about what is going to be ahead of them living with MS. And I felt like we need to get these two groups to talk to one another. So I had this idea that I would conduct the largest study of health and aging with MS in Canada. So that was a pretty big thing. And it's amazing how when you start talking to people, so I had this vision of what I wanted to do. I wanted to interview and survey hundreds and hundreds of older people with MS in Canada and learn from them. So I started phoning people, and I phoned people like Dr. Ruth Ann Mary, who said, okay, and let me contact people. So what I'm going to do today is try to summarize some of the lessons that we learned through this process of talking to individuals. So I think we all think about aging. I know I think about it as I get older. What do I want? I want to live a long, healthy life. I want to be productive. I want to have a very intact cognition. I want my body to work. I want to have fun. I want to spend time with hopefully grandchildren that I might have down the road. And aging, the concept of aging has changed a lot even in my lifetime. This was an interesting article published in 2012 about the baby boomers and what they're asking for in terms of old age. Not your mother's old age, baby boomers at age 65. This is a really good example of what aging might look like now. This is Madonna, if people don't know who this is, and she is 54 when this picture was taken. So imagine doing this, no less, at 54 in go-go boots. This is not easy, but this is what we're starting to expect from aging and what we see. And these two people are both past 75 years of age and have totally different lifestyles. And I think we'll choose which one we want. And people with MS are living now longer than ever before. It's because of the use of disease-modifying drugs, better diagnosis, better management of comorbid conditions, and overall, our population in Canada in particular is aging. This was a slide that was given to me by Dr. John Fisk in Nova Scotia, and it maps their cohort of people over time. So if you look on the vertical axis, you can see the prevalence per 100,000 population. This is people with MS. And on the bottom are the age groups. And each line represents a 5-year period. So you can see on the bottom there is the prevalence in 1990, but on the very top you'll see the prevalence in 2010. And you'll see that the peak prevalence is shifting gradually towards an older group. So the peak prevalence now, more recently, is in that 55 to 59 age group. So people are living long lives with MS. The question is, how can we squeeze the most out of those years as we possibly can? So both these people are individuals who I met with. So this was a study where I wanted to learn about aging with MS from the experts. So some people I interviewed face-to-face, sometimes by telephone, but most people filled out a survey. And you might have, some people in the group may even have filled out the survey. If you did, thank you. And I promise that I will put it all the findings together in a book eventually. But I'm going to give you some smatterings of some of the lessons that we learned. This is, every dot is a person across the country who participated. And so you can see that mostly in cities, but certainly a smattering of people from all around Canada. There was 743 people, and you'd say, well, so there are people who are 55 years of age and older, but they have had to have had MS for at least 20 years. To give you sort of an idea, there were 743, like I said, mainly women, 3 to 1. There was about 160 men in the survey. They had lived for MS on average around 32 to 33 years, so they're very familiar with living with MS. The majority were walking but using a cane to walk. So there were women using a cane to walk. They were living at home and on average lived with MS around 34 years. The vast majority had never taken any disease-modifying drugs because they weren't available at the time that they were diagnosed. And they also told us that they had lived, from their perspective, they had symptoms probably for 10 to 15 years before they were officially diagnosed. And some people told us that they actually traveled long distances to the Montreal Neurological Institute back in the 90s to get diagnosed because it was so difficult at that time. So this is sort of a little idea of the individuals, their mobility. So about 100 of the group could walk around without a cane. Another 100 used a cane. The vast majority used rollator walkers or regular walkers. And then we had a group of about 50 who told us that they didn't get out of bed. They stayed all their day in bed. And about 100 people who told us that their primary mode of mobility was a wheelchair. So in general, this is what they look like. So despite having more walking problems, it was interesting because we compared this group to other Canadians their age through Statistics Canada, and we found some interesting things. So this group of older people with MS who are still living at home exercised more, drank less alcohol, and were more likely to be non-smokers than other Canadians their age. So you can see, just as an example, this is the percentage of the sample. Older people with MS is red, and the Statistics Canada sample. So you can see that the Statistics Canada sample of older people were more likely to be walking independently, but they were less likely to be doing regular exercise and more likely to be doing no physical activity. So this was an interesting finding. So here we find these older people with MS. You'd think that they'd be exercising less, but actually they're living at home, they're exercising more. This is interesting. We then asked them about, there was a part of the survey that I just said, from your perspective, what do you think contributes the most to healthy aging with MS? We asked a few questions, but this is one of the questions that was perhaps the richest. People gave us volumes of material, personal stories, journal entries, and we were able to take all this text, hundreds and hundreds of pages of text, and classify it into sort of top 3 areas from the person's perspective. From their perspective, they felt the number one factor that contributed to their ability to live a long and healthy life with MS is social connections. So people are nodding in the group. Like it was interesting. It wasn't going to the doctor. It wasn't medications. Now keep in mind they didn't have disease-modifying therapies. So social connections was number 1. Number 2 was attitude and outlook, and they described it as positivity, determination, and perseverance. And they told us about stories where things happened, they didn't know what was going on, and they just kept fighting and fighting and having that resilience as the years went on. And the last was an adherence to a healthy lifestyle. So I'm going to try, since this is their stories, I'm going to try to hit some points that came out. I may go over time, so when I'm at 5 minutes, just wave at me. And yeah. So we learned some important things, and that, like I said, there was 160 men in the group, and you would think, oh, you know, MS is MS and people age, but like we've heard some partly today with Dr. Pratt, you know, there is differences. People have their own personal experience with living with MS, and what we found is that men and women are actually quite different. Despite, and in our cohort, despite there were similarities in age, years with MS, their level of mobility and social support, compared to older women with MS, older men were really having much more challenges. They had lower levels of resilience, higher levels of depressive symptoms, poor diet habits, less participation in household and out-of-home activities, and poorer perceived overall health. So this was a big concern, and actually this article made the rounds on global news. And I don't know the solution to it, but I do feel that we need to support men with MS and perhaps think about a different way to support them. The other issue that came up was depression, and someone asked a question about depression. So in this cohort, we learned that 44.5% of people were either diagnosed with depression or had high levels of depressive symptoms. And 55.5% did not have depression. In the overall sample, we were surprised to see that only 12% were prescribed antidepressants and only 13% used any psychosocial services. That means support. We included support groups, seeing a social worker, seeing a psychologist. So it's a mismatch. We have a large group of people who have depression, but yet there seems to be low treatment of that depression. And furthermore, the people who were undertreated, so the people who were diagnosed with depression but still had depressive symptoms, when you compare them to the people who had depression but were well treated, the respondents with the high depressive symptoms were almost 2 times more likely not to exercise, 2 times more likely to consume a poor diet, 3.3 times less participation in life roles, and twice more likely to have poorer quality of life. So it tells us that maybe we can't cure MS, but we certainly can treat depression. And all these, we just heard about how important social connectedness is and adhering to a healthy lifestyle. If you have depression, it's very, very hard to do these things that promote a healthy lifestyle. So I would say that what we learned is that it's very important to seek out treatment for depression. If you have depression, it's going to probably affect the whole, it'll place a cloud over your whole living with MS and living in general. So to sort of hit, so social connectedness, attitude, and the last item was the lifestyle. And so people broke things out for us and told us that exercise, physical activity was number 1, and second to that was diet. So I'm going to try to hit those for you today. So there is new evidence to suggest that lifestyle behaviors such as smoking, diet, and exercise have the potential to modify the disease course in MS and may explain why some people progress in a different way than other people do. I'm first going to talk about exercise. This was the first study that really showed that exercise makes a difference in the disease of MS. And they used an animal model, which Dr. Pratt talked about before, called EAE, which is experimental autoimmune encephalitis. It's the model that you often see in studies about MS. What they do with this animal is they inject the animal with myelin basic protein, which is just myelin bits, and then they inject the animal with pertussis toxin, usually. And the two together will cause this autoimmune reaction where the animal will fight against its own myelin and break down myelin, and it becomes very similar to MS. So they did this in this animal model, and then they exposed the animal to a running wheel. And they just asked the question, by exposing this animal to the running wheel, do we change the way this disease is going to manifest in this mouse? And what they showed is that there are two trajectories. So in this model, at about 10 days, the symptoms manifest. And you can see on the vertical axis is the clinical score. So a worse clinical score means worse neurological outcome. And then the days are on the horizontal axis in the bottom. So the animals that received, the EAE animal that received exercise, you can see that their relapse and the extent of their clinical disease wasn't as bad as the animals that just had regular exposure. And then they were able to take out the neurons, which is an excellent thing that you can do in animal models. You can actually take out the brain, freeze the brain, slice the brain so you can actually see through it like tissue paper, and then you can count all the projections on the neurons so we get a sense of how healthy each neuron is. And you can see on the top is a normal control animal, very sort of spiky neurons, and then the EAE animal looks a little bit sparse, and the animal with exercise looks more branchy, which is the brain that we want. We want a healthy branchy brain with lots of branchy neurons. Can you hand me my water down there? Thank you. So this is a study, so that was in animals. So the question is, have we shown anything at all in humans? And there is actually a couple of studies. This is an older one, but I think it's important. So what they did is they asked 21 people, females with relapsing remitting MS, to participate in this study. They did a sophisticated series of neuropsychological tests. Then they did these high-resolution MRIs. So voxel-based morphometry just means that you have little tiny voxels with a high resolution, and you can look at the structure of the brain. And they were able to tease out the gray matter, so all the neurons, and the white matter, which is all the transmission of axons. And what they found was that the people who had higher cardiorespiratory fitness, so they did a full fitness test on a metabolic chart, just like a stress test that you would do if you had a cardiac problem. The people with higher cardiorespiratory fitness was associated with less gray and white matter loss in specific areas, which the areas are there, you can see lit up in the yellow and the green. Faster cognitive processing speed and overall less lesion load. So this is one of the first studies that says there might be something here. Exercise might be protective and providing, helping the brain maintain its health over the long term. So I'll mention, I wasn't going to mention too much in our work in our own lab, but I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things we do. So we're interested in this. We think that if we can create, so say for example, you have a new symptom like incoordination in your hand or more spasticity in your leg, we think that we could create rehabilitation interventions that with really high dosage of training that we could help restore some of your lost abilities. That's what our thinking is, to try to drive plasticity. So we measure this inside this plasticity within the brain using this device called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what you do, you have a magnetic coil, you place it over the brain, it emits a pulse, and because you know how the left side of my brain controls the right side of my body, the right side controls the left side of my body, I can stimulate the brain that will pierce through painlessly through the scalp, through the skull, into the brain, and stimulate the muscle that I want in my hand. So then I can look at the speed and how well that transmits. So it's like thinking a CAT scan or MRI tells you about the structure, how is everything looking. But TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, tells you about the function, how fast are messages being transmitted back and forth. So we use this in our lab to figure out if we can change brain function. So so you'll see in this image, so this is the output you see. So you stimulate the brain, that's called a TMS artifact, that's a little boop. Then there's a period of silence, and that tells you that period is the time it takes for that TMS pulse to get to your hand. Then there's a motor evoked potential, so that's the muscle reacting. And then there's a period of silence after, which tells you your brain's quiet period. And then there's activity again in the muscle. So all this we can measure, and each thing means a different thing. So this silent period after the motor evoked potential, I know I'm getting technical, but it's good to think and concentrate and expand your neuroplasticity. So this period, so all of us have excitability in your brain. You have a readiness. You have low levels of excitability if you're sleepy and sort of, medicated, or you're tired. You usually see this low level of excitability. You have a readiness in your brain to learn and to experience and for neuroplasticity to take place. This silent period after that motor evoked potential seems to be a marker of that. So a longer silent period means your brain is sleepier and it's inhibited. So that length seems to be important. So what we found, and this was interesting, so we took a group of people, 50 people with MS. We asked them to participate, do a full fitness test, do cognitive tests, the 9-hole peg test, which some of you may have already done, and then do this TMS. And what we saw was that there's this interesting phenomenon. So we said, well, we have groups of people, they're all women, they all have a similar profile of MS. The only thing different about them is their fitness. Some people are really fit, and some people were not very fit because they weren't participating in exercise. And we could actually pick them out by their TMS. So on the top, you'll see somebody who has excellent cardiorespiratory fitness. So their fitness was in the upper end. They were almost like an athlete. These were all people in their 30s, and they were all females, and they all were walking with no gait aids or no trouble walking. So you can see that period after the motor evoked potential is really short, 67.44 milliseconds. The person next underneath there is in the very poor. You can see that it's getting a little wider, 79.9 milliseconds of silent period. And the person on the bottom, who has really, really low fitness, worse than very poor category, has a really long cortical silent period. So this is important because your brain's inhibition, if you have too much inhibition or flattening like this in your neurons, it means that you're less able to learn new things. Your brain has less capacity for neuroplasticity. So this is important. It's the first step to understand what fitness might be doing to the brain. And here's another way of looking at that. So on the Vertical axis is the cardiorespiratory fitness measured, like I said, we have people sit on this recumbent stepper and you move with your arms and your legs and you wear a mask on your face, so we're able to look at how much carbon dioxide you breathe out. And the bottom is this cortical silent period. And you can see that the less fit you are, the longer, more inhibition you have. See, that line is tilted like that, and that's what that means. And that's even accounting for how long you've had MS, controlling for your EDSS score, so people might know what that is. It's the neurologist score that they give you. So the message is that fitness has direct effects on preserving your brain's capacity for neuroplasticity. I think that this is not unique to MS. I think this is for everybody. Is a message for everybody that fitness does have a direct effect on your brain. The challenge is that people with MS find it very hard to exercise. And we'll talk about that in a second. And when you look at our cohort in general, if you look at this slide, you'll see I have a dotted, I have a line at the 20% mark there. So it says poor, there's a line. And you'll see almost everybody in that cohort have fitness in the very poor and poor categories. So that's a concern, and it doesn't matter whether you use a cane, a walker, no cane, it's across the board. So something is going on, and I think we need to help people exercise more. And there's lots of reasons why exercise is extremely challenging. Our work shows that the main big things are your fatigue and any problems that you have with pain and movement of your arm and leg. Your attitude is the second biggest thing, and the third item is fatigue. Those are the biggest factors limiting exercise. One thing we worked on in our lab, which was funded by the MS Society, is that we asked the question, well, what about if you cool the room? If you had a group of people, they got to exercise either in a room held at 21 degrees, which would be ambient temperature like this room, or a room at 16 degrees Celsius. What about if we cool them down? If we cool them down, maybe they'd feel less heat sensitivity, less fatigue, and maybe be able to do more. So, in fact, that's what we found. We focused on the calf muscle because we thought, well, that's the muscle you're using when you're walking. And if you feel unsteady, that's probably some of the muscles that are making you feel unsteady. And what we found is that the torque of the muscle, so how much the muscle could push out, the more your body increased in temperature, the worse the torque in the muscle is. So it is related to your body temperature. And then when we cool the room, so the people in the cool room, you want to stay at the 0 in terms of muscle fatigue. The people in the cool room did the exact same amount of exercise, but did not have the muscle fatigue as the people in the warm room. So you can see the muscle EMG got worse. So I think that one technique to exercise is probably to cool the room, cool your environment, wear clothes that can come off so that you can, as you get warm, that you don't get overheated. But I do think exercise is important. You have to try to implement it in some way in a step-by-step fashion. The next thing I'm going to talk about is diet. There's so many things online and some studies, but diet is a very difficult study to do because what we know is your diet is your lifestyle. Like most of us eat in a similar pattern as we did as children in our own families. So if you were to implement a diet trial, like a clinical trial, we know it takes a long time to see any benefits. So there hasn't been really good, strong evidence about any particular diet. This is sort of the 5 main categories that have been examined, and I'm going to pick 2. Poly-unsaturated fatty acids and antioxidant-rich foods or supplements or vitamins. Those are the 2 biggies where there's quite a lot of research being done. More. So can you, by what you eat or your health and lifestyle, influence your MS? That's the question. So we said in exercise, possibly. You probably have some direct effects on your brain. What about what you eat? This was a study, and I think it's an important study, by Dr. Ruth Ann Mary, who many of you will know. And this study has been cited hundreds and hundreds of times as an important step in the field. She asked the question whether if you had a vascular comorbidity, so a sign of you had high blood pressure, high lipids, diabetes, anything that was a sign of perhaps not a healthy diet, is it associated with more rapid disability progression in MS? And she was able to use this NARCOMS registry. So if you're not familiar with NARCOMS, you should check it out. It's a registry where people can volunteer to be part of this registry. You enter your information. Each year you'll get a queue to put your information in. So she was able to take almost 9,000 people out of this registry and try to understand the impact of having high cholesterol, hypertension, diabetes. And what she found was that the people who had cardiovascular comorbid conditions developed walking problems 1.5 times faster than the people who didn't. And she explained in this paper that if you have any of these vascular comorbid conditions on top of your MS, that you lose about 6 years of independent walking. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a lot. I think it's a lot. So that's why she is so passionate about comorbid conditions, because it's so important to keep control and make sure people are doing all the right things to keep yourself healthy. And there are a few small studies suggest that lipid profiles are associated with more lesions over 24 months. This is people who are on interferon beta, and they're newly diagnosed. So this was a study that people were involved in. There was 135 people newly diagnosed with MS, and what they found was that higher LDL, so this is your low-density lipoproteins, your so-called like bad cholesterol, and total cholesterol associated with increased accumulation of new T2 lesions over 2 years. So I'm talking about fatty acids, cholesterol, and there's low density and high density lipoproteins, and I'm not an expert in this, but in general, the high density lipoproteins are your healthier food. So let's think about what are some of the sources of high density lipoproteins in food. They are your omega-3s, your omega-6s. Many of you are probably aware of these. They play an essential role in the spine and the brain and the central nervous system. It's needed to create and repair myelin. And of course, myelin surrounds the nerve fibers and is damaged in MS. And some of the dietary sources of these omega-6s and omega-3s, which are your good fats, are things like seeds, lentils, peas, beans, evening primrose oil, oily fish, certain kinds of nuts and seeds, and like I said, some beans. So trying to make sure your diet has these healthy fats. Unfortunately, though, the research, once again, when I talk about this, the research is not really strong. This was what's called a Cochrane review, and if you're ever interested in learning things about what, if you were to consolidate all this research together in one big pot, what does it mean? If you go under online called the Cochrane Library, C-O-C-H-R-A-N-E. So in that library, they have teams of people who consolidate all the research on a hot topic, and then in the end give you some kind of direction about what this all tells us. And so the author's conclusion, this was 2012, and there has not been an update since this 2012 study was done. And you can see that there was only 4 studies, so there's not a lot of studies. So they said polyunsaturated fatty acids seem to have No major effect on the main clinical outcome in MS, like disease progression, but they may tend to make the frequency of relapses over 2 years, may tend to reduce the relapses over 2 years. Hence, the data that are available are insufficient to basically to recommend this. So to me, there's a signal, there's something maybe that your diet is probably beneficial. Of the people in the room, who are on a special diet for their MS consideration? MS. Yeah. So, there's thinking around that. You're probably on the right track. The other area is antioxidants. So this is about you're either taking antioxidants as a supplement or eating. For me, I have my blueberries, and in Newfoundland we have a berry called a partridge berry, which would be very similar to a cranberry. So that's to try to get my antioxidants in there. So that's the next field that seems to be blossoming, is this idea of antioxidants. So we know that as we age, and if you have MS, your neurons are struggling. It's normal for cells to die in your body. As we age, this is a normal process. When the cells die, or when they're struggling, they release free radicals. And these free radicals go around and they try to grab electrons from neighboring cells. So struggling cells that are dying release these free radicals. The free radicals try to rob electrons from good cells and therefore start to cause a cascade of problems to your neighboring cells. What an antioxidant does is provide that electron so that the free radical doesn't damage its neighbor. That's what an antioxidant does. So many of the foods we eat have lots of antioxidants in them. And you could think about, well, how could this be helpful for MS? And we really don't know very much. This, fortunately, you're going to have this. I know there's a lot of material here, but there seems to be sort of work in 4 main areas, like vitamins, ginkgo biloba, polyphenols, including luteolin, quercetin, curcumin, EGCG, which is green tea, resveratrol. Who knows what resveratrol is? In red wine. And ALA. Everyone's like, does anyone take any special about antioxidants, any of these things? Yeah, yeah. Red wine. So my students and I, in a project, sort of reviewed all the literature that was available, and we published this a couple of years ago, and we went back into animal models, into Petri dishes, trying to figure out what evidence is there for any of these antioxidants. Do any of them work? So this is a busy slide, but I'm going to tell you how to decode it. If there's a check mark, it means that there's evidence to support this particular antioxidant. An X means that there's evidence there's no benefit. It means it's been tested and there's no benefit. And an O means that there's no evidence yet. No experiments have been undertaken that prove it one way or the other. So no evidence. And then on the left side, you'll see we've separated by animal models and MS patients. So let's go on the bottom first. So on the top, you can see we have luteolin, like in broccoli, quercetin, like cranberries. Like I said, I have my partridge berries every morning. Curcumin, like turmeric. Resveratrol, vitamin A, C, E, ginkgo biloba. So I've mapped them all out. So my students and I did this, not just me. We all did this. But on the bottom, you'll see right away lots of zeros. Do you see that? Lots of zeros. So there's really not much done at all in people with MS in terms of using antioxidants. So it tells us we need way more research. And the studies that have been done, do you see how I have a check mark, sometimes a check mark and an X? It means that some studies said it was beneficial and other studies said it was not beneficial. So I think we can't take much from this yet in terms of its benefits in people with MS. However, if we turn to animal models, we start to see a little bit, some things that could be beneficial. Berries, possibly, turmeric, possibly, green tea, and alpha lipoic acid, ALA. But like I said, all animal models, not clinical trials. It's, as long as it doesn't hurt you, you know, you have to use good judgment. And so that's the result. The next thing I'll point out is smoking. And like I told you, of our sample of older people with MS, the vast majority were non-smokers or who told us that they had quit smoking years and years ago when they were first diagnosed with MS 35 years ago. I'm not going to say how many, like there might have been 7 or 8 smokers in that whole group, which surprised us. But when you think about what cigarettes are, your brain, my brain, is aging. It is battling the death of cells, the toxins in your environment, and it has to, there's these free radicals that are being produced. So it's a bit of a battleground. My brain is a battleground. And I want to preserve my brain because I want to stay cognitively and physically well as long as I can. When you think about what's in a cigarette and how toxic it is to your body and brain, it's just amazing. Carbon monoxide, arsenic, ammonia, acetone, which is like nail polish remover, hydrogen cyanide, naphthalene, which is found in mothballs, sulfur compounds, lead, volatile alcohol, formaldehyde used in embalming fluid, butane, and then you're smoking this into one of your most richest organs, your lungs, with this beautiful blood supply, and you're delivering it, hand delivering it into your systemic circulation. So it's not surprising that the people who've lived the longest with MS weren't smokers. Unfortunately, studies have shown that smoking is a risk factor for MS in the first place. So this was a study with 192 people with MS and 384 matched controls, and they had blood bank samples, and they measured a product, it's a nicotine metabolite called cotinine, and they found that the people who had cotinine in their blood, so this is looking backwards, had 1.5 times higher odds ratio for getting MS. For young people who are less than 26 years of age, the odds ratio was twice as likely to get MS. And maybe that's not anything we can do if you have MS now, but think about your children, your grandchildren, who probably have a higher genetic risk, even if you can counsel them to say, you know, why don't you think about what you're doing with smoking? Who knows what vaping is doing? Look, we have no idea, because vaping is also lots of chemicals. There's a lot of issues about vaping, but we have no idea what vaping could be doing. So the studies are pretty strong. These are several good studies. The top one by Dr. Ruth Ann Mary. Smokers with multiple sclerosis are more likely to report other comorbid autoimmune diseases. Tobacco smoking and disability progression in multiple sclerosis. This is a United Kingdom cohort study. Alcohol, coffee, fish smoking, and disease progression in MS. So smoking has been evaluated in large cohort studies. And here's I'll give you the main key points. Smoking is associated with increased lesions and greater brain atrophy. MS disease progression is more rapid in the ever smokers, so people who smoked in their lifetime. People with MS who stopped smoking either before or after onset of disease had a slower progression of disability, so even if you quit, you're still good. Smokers with MS are more likely to develop other comorbid diseases than non-smokers. And what we already talked about, comorbid diseases and their impact on MS. So the last point I'm going to talk about is alcohol. And in general, in our cohort of older people with MS, they were low users or moderate users of alcohol, I would say. Most of them told us they had 1 to 2 drinks per week. Now, people who do survey research, you know that surveys are notoriously incorrect, and people tend to underestimate their alcohol consumption and their body weight. 2 things that get underestimated for the most part. We think we drink less and we have more of a svelte figure than we actually have. So there are risks of alcohol. Cardiovascular disease, cirrhosis of the liver, cancer, all cause mortality, high blood pressure. We know that. The question is, does it matter in terms of MS? So there hasn't been very much work in this area. This is one study of a group in Belgium who've been following a cohort of people with MS over years and years and years. And this study showed that moderate to minimal consumption, so the 1 to 7 drinks per week, so on the low end, could potentially be protective, but high consumption seemed to be a negative effect. And they weren't sure. They explained it could be a beneficial impact on the immune system. It could be lowering systemic inflammation, or there might be some anti-inflammatory processes, because remember we talked about how red wine has resveratrol. There could be some benefit in having a small 1 drink a day. And the researchers talked about this U-shaped curve, and several of the papers keep talking about this and bringing it forward. And the idea is that if you do everything in moderation, is mainly what it says, that if you're in the middle and moderately drinking alcohol, you're probably fine. It might be beneficial. But when you're too much and beyond that, so 1 to 2 for 1 drink a day is probably not harmful. It might be beneficial, but more than that is probably not beneficial. So we've covered an awful lot of material, but I think we can put health and lifestyle factors in 2 camps. We have the protective things, and we have the detrimental things, and we have alcohol that sort of sits in the middle. So on the protective side, we have exercise, our healthy diet, because we're thinking about the comorbid conditions, the antioxidants, the good fatty acids. Social connectedness, remember we talked about that in depression. Positive attitude, that's definitely on the protective side. And on the detrimental side, I didn't talk about obesity today, but there is some evidence that obesity can aggravate MS. And smoking is definitely in the detrimental category. And then alcohol is like I said, it's sort of in the middle. So we learned a lot by this study. It took about 3 years to do it. It was partially funded by the MS Society through a fellowship that I had. And all the sites in Canada just volunteered. What I had to do was I found money here and there to pay for a summer student. But then they had to call people who had MS more than 20 years, who probably hadn't been in the clinic for ages, and they phoned them to participate in this study. And the study, the telephone calls and the surveys were really long. The survey was almost 40 pages long. So yeah, it was really long. And I'm really grateful for people with MS who take the time to participate in research. And one of the promises I've made is that I will collate this either into an online resource or a book, something that's freely available that you can read about. Because I think when 743 grandmothers and grandfathers tell you how to live a healthy life, I think you should listen. And the question is, who are the experts? I think those people are the experts, and the people with the lived experience like yourself are the experts. I would encourage you to participate if you possibly can in any kind of, like these big NARCIMES registries or registries that help to collate things to make a story. Over years, it builds into a story. And I think also the experts are the scientists who are really trying to pull this all together over years and years. So I think it's great, everyone's working together. And the last group of experts is probably your physicians, your neurologists, your family doctors, people who are trying to help you with your comorbid conditions, track your MS and your own personal experience. So I'm glad to say that's what the MS Society does, is really bring all these experts together, and I think working together, we can conquer it. Thank you. Any thoughts, questions? Yes. Yeah. Okay.
The relationship is. Thank you very much. I'll start again for those not in the room. So I'm curious what you think the relationship is between, I guess, diet now versus smoking in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, we had doctors on TV telling us the health benefits of smoking. And right now, there are movements against modern agricultural practices that infuse our food with GMOs, pesticides, and herbicides that some would argue have the same list of toxic chemicals in them that a cigarette does. Yet, we're not as advanced, right? So do you think in 50 years, the food that we consume today because of modern agricultural practices will be viewed as toxic in the same way that cigarettes are right now?
Yes. You know, I think there's a movement towards knowing where your food comes from, and we don't even understand, like, why do we have all these autoimmune diseases? And there's genetics, but there's also environment. There's some, all these factors are going into a soup, and we just don't understand what that is. So yes, I think that we're probably eating things and drinking things that are not healthy, but we don't know today, and maybe in 25 or 30 years, the realization will know, but we don't know right now. But I agree that, there's a whole movement, homesteading is becoming more groups of people who want to know where the food came from. That's probably sort of pushback from the produced food that we've been eating.
Hi there. This is a question from Chelsea of Dauphin, Manitoba. The question is, for a 70-year-old MS patient, what would be the max and minimum of steps, that's written in quotations, you would recommend for walking daily?
Now that's, so this is how I would put it. You want to aim for 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise. And when I say moderate, I mean you're feeling a little bit of the stress, but you can sort of still talk with the person next to you. You don't feel completely out of breath. So you have to accumulate 150 minutes. But it depends on, for some people, walking 100 steps is easy. And another person, walking 100 steps is enormously challenging, and their heart rate is really high. So it has to go by what you feel. Try to accumulate that 150 minutes. It doesn't matter to me, break it up. Do it regularly. There are guidelines actually online. The MS Society of Canada has activity guidelines. That's a good place to start, and they're saying exactly what I'm saying, 150 minutes in that moderate zone. I would break it up throughout your week, so divide it up over 7 days and try to get in a little bit, like 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes each one of those days and try to get it to add up to 150. So it's not really an answer to the question because it's hard to say how many steps, but your Fitbit says, 10,000 steps, but is that realistic for everyone? Probably not. But if you start at 0, I think 100 steps is still better than 0. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Was there a question over here somewhere?
Remember that it wasn't that long ago. So when I started off in the 80s as a physiotherapist, many people with MS were told not to exercise. They were told to take it easy because it makes your symptoms worse. And so there has been, in the last 20 years, a paradigm shift and the realization that we were giving people the wrong information and that by not being active is not good for MS at all. You have to be active. And like I said, try to accumulate the 150 minutes.
I've got a question over here.
Oh.
What would you recommend for somebody who's in a wheelchair who cannot walk? What would you recommend for exercise? If you go to a refit center, there's maybe one machine that she used to be able to use, but I don't know if she can now. But what would you recommend for someone like that?
So certain things I would do is sometimes people who use wheelchairs there's a thinking in people's head that you use a wheelchair meaning that you cannot stand at all. But in fact, some people who use a wheelchair can stand with help holding on. So simple things like, and I'm just going from highest to lowest, sit to stand. So there's evidence in people with stroke that even doing 20 sit to stands a day can benefit fitness and mobility. So I'm just starting with that. Don't forget that your arms being close to your heart, arm movement improves cardiorespiratory fitness. So arm cycling, arm strengthening, they're big muscles. So if you get them moving together in a rhythmical way continuously, you'll actually get benefits to not only strengthen your arms, but also cardiorespiratory fitness. You will have to rely mainly on your arms if you can't do a sit-to-stand transfer. So that's sort of, so. And you don't necessarily need a lot of equipment. You could, yes, people invest in arm bicycles, but you don't really need arm bicycles. You can do elastic band work. You can do light weights, just tomato soup cans, alternating arms. So as long as you're using those big muscles in that rhythmical way for continuous, as long as you can do it till you feel your heart rate's coming up, that's beneficial. Does that answer your question? Sort of. So certain things like do you know what I mean by TheraBand? There's elastic bands. Sometimes you can tie that and use that, go across I'm here giving therapy stuff now, across your body. It's really good because when you pull across your body, you're getting a lot more core stability work as opposed to pulling down. So there's ways to do it. And I feel like if you have a very peculiar type of mobility challenge, you really need to talk to the physiotherapist and say, here's my thoughts. This is what I tried and didn't work or did work. And he or she could probably come up with 3 or 4 options that hit the strengthening, hit the cardio. And so that would be my thought. I know. Yeah.
When you talked about interviewing 700 and some people, were they divided into primary progressive versus relapsing remitting, or were they mainly relapsing remitting you talked to?
So I forget the actual numbers, but almost all of them were secondary progressive or primary progressive. About 60% told us that they were initially diagnosed with relapsing remitting, but now were secondary progressive. And that's not surprising because you think about their age and the fact that they were never on disease-modifying drugs. And so yeah, the vast majority were progressive, yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Good. Thank you very much.